Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 346. This week the questions are taken from guide 418 to the Royal Sovereign class almost pre-dreadnoughts, the Wednesday video on Admiral Rozisvensky, and the Friday video on naval gunnery, why battleships sometimes miss after they've scored a hit. So let's get on with questions, shall we? Warrant Officer Will asks, I seem to recall in a previous Drydock you answered a question about how most or all ironclads tended to only have either turreted armament like USS Monitor or casemate guns like CSS Virginia, because by the time anyone had thought about using both, Harvey Steel was right round the corner. However, ever since the video on the full storm of ironclads, I've been wondering, had the full storm not been the stumbling block it was, but actually the beginning of the ironclad era, assuming that these advances don't lead to Harvey Steel being invented earlier, would this result in us seeing more ironclads with both turrets or barbettes and casemates for their main batteries? I don't think so on two main grounds. Separately to the two grounds, there's the fact that obviously Harvey Steel requires the development of mass-producible steel in the first place, and then its development into Harvey Steel, and the development of things like the Bessemer process are somewhat separate to the construction of iron ships. But, returning to the main point, the two biggest issues with having a ship with a combined armament, where its main turret is partly in turrets and partly in casemates, in the ironclad era, and that's obviously separate to things like the Scharnhorst armoured cruisers, is firstly weight, because if you are putting substantial amounts of iron armour in, as we've established, that's going to weigh a huge amount, and therefore you're going to want to have the largest guns in the smallest area, which is why they initially went from broadside ironclads to centre battery ironclads or turreted ironclads, and then the turret gradually obviously supplants the centre battery, because it essentially becomes a race of how big a gun can we get on a ship, and once they realise this is pretty much the biggest they can fit, well, you've only got very few of them, so you need to make the most efficient use of them possible. So obviously a long broadside is an inefficient use of big heavy guns, because, well, if you use a lot of them, then the ship will roll over and sink unless you use smaller ones, so therefore you have fewer guns. If you have fewer guns, they take up less space, therefore you need to protect less area, therefore the armour can be thicker, therefore the armour is actually meaningful, and then that explains broadside to centre battery. And then when you're looking at the centre battery, even then you might have a few big guns concentrated in centre battery, but there's still half of them at least useless on the other side of the ship, because you can't get them to cross over there, apart from anything, there wouldn't be enough gun ports, and therefore at that point the turret makes more sense, because you can get even bigger guns mounted dead on the centre line, ideally, and they can fire, again, ideally, either side of the ship. So you're making much more efficient use of the guns with turrets than even a centre battery. Whereas even if ironclads had been a thing for a lot longer, the problem with having a mixed turret and centre battery or casement armament would simply be that some of the guns are not being used as efficiently as others, and you need the biggest guns possible to punch through enemy armour. So if you have the weight to spare to have both turrets and casemates, then the logic of the period would say, well, instead of doing that, just use the weight that you would be using in one or the other to enhance the guns and armour on one and scrap the other. And related to that is the second reason, and that is simply what kind of threat are you actually trying to meet? Because a lot of the ships that had turret setup, so this, for example, is HMS Monarch, you can see she's got two turrets amidships, they realise, well, they can't fire fore or aft, so they put some 7-inch guns, in this case, in essentially unarmoured positions, fore and aft, basically bow and stern chasers. But outside of having that little bit of anti-ship firepower, there wasn't much need for any other kind of gun, because a smaller ship, which potentially might fire a little bit faster, couldn't meaningfully hurt the Monarch, and if it was going to fight a peer opponent, it needed the biggest guns that it could find. And there wasn't any call for anything else, really. It's only when you start to see the advent of small, fast attack craft that can hurt big ships, like torpedo boats, that that people start thinking, oh, hang on a minute, we might need some other kind of gun on our big ships. And yes, you can point to some experiments where they tried to stick massive guns on cruisers, but that kind of weight of a heavy gun on a cruiser really had to wait until the steel era. So when we're talking about purely ironclads, the only time you're going to start seeing them put substantial numbers of smaller guns, which might then necessitate a casemate battery, would be once torpedo boats come about, which historically, iron ships being around earlier, is probably unlikely to accelerate all that much. Scott Giles asks, have you covered the most extreme cases of using a historic and grand ship name on a tiny, small and inappropriate vessel? Think of a name like Hood or Enterprise being used on a harbour patrol cutter, for example. Well, the funny thing is, a lot of what we think of today as the best ship names actually start out on some pretty small ships. I mean, the first 5 USS Enterprises were a mixture of sloops and schooners, and this one was, that you see here from the latter part of the 19th century, was probably the biggest. And at no point in the first, 150 odd years of the US Navy was the USS Enterprise anything close to what would count as a capital ship of the period. And then you get CV6, and that all changes. Likewise, Devastation. The first 2 Devastations in the Royal Navy were bomb vessels, aka basically little mortar sloops, or mortar brigs, depending on how they're rigged. And then the next one was a little paddle sloop, and then you got the Devastation class turret ship. And the flip side to that is actually a lot of really cool names that sound like they should be capital ship names actually end up in quite a number of navies being given to destroyers. And in some cases, the names can bounce back and forth between capital ships and destroyers. Now, admittedly, a destroyer is still a frontline warship, even in the time period that the channel covers, so it's not a terrible fate, but still, if the name has been given previously to a battleship or a ship of the line, you might see it as a bit of a come down to give it to a destroyer. And indeed, some of the really, really cool names that you think should absolutely be capital ship names have only ever been on destroyers and small craft like that. Literal Dirt asks, what's with the turret layout on the planned G3 class battlecruisers and N3 class battleships? Why did they choose 2 front turrets and 1 middle turret as opposed to 2 in the front and 1 in the back, or some other layout? Well, they did initially look at those kinds of layouts, and a lot of the predecessors, so the L's, J's, H's, etc., and the M's for the N3s, all of those tended for the most part, although perhaps not so much in some of the battlecruiser designs, but they generally tended to have more conventional layouts with either balanced fore and aft twins or 2 triples forward, 1 triple aft, something like that. What the G3s and the N3s reflect, though, is that the Royal Navy was trying to come up with the most powerful ship that they could in the smallest package that they could. And part of it, admittedly, was governed by budget considerations, but actually the bigger consideration was shipyards, because some of the really big designs they had, there were a few shipyards that could fit them, but they were pretty much exclusively shipyards that were in the UK, and there weren't that many of those, which would mean the ships would essentially, in terms of being able to repair battle damage and such, be stuck on home defence duty. You couldn't use them overseas. Whereas if you could reduce the size of the hull, then you could use the ships all over the British Empire. But if you reduce the size of the hull on a conventional layout, you'd either have to downgrade speed, protection, or firepower, and they didn't really want to do that, although they did end up having to sacrifice firepower somewhat with the G3s, because originally they wanted 18-inch guns on the battlecruisers as well. And this concentration of the main battery was one of the measures to allow them to reduce weight and reduce overall hull size, because it reduced the amount of citadel space taken up by the main battery. And the reason for that is fairly simple. Basically, if you want to have your main battery citadel, you have to obviously protect it with belt armor on either side, but then you have to think about the ends, because your enemy probably isn't just going to fight you at a pure perpendicular broadside angle. So you need to either extend whatever armor you think is going to protect your magazines fore and aft of those magazines to catch shots coming in from an angle, or you have to use a bulkhead. And depending on the beam of the ship at that point and how much of an angle you want to guard against, one or the other might be a more weight effective solution. So in the case of the G3s, well, in the case of pretty much most ships, once you get to a certain point forward, as the hull starts to narrow, putting a bulkhead straight across the ship might actually cost the same or perhaps less weight than extending the belt armor forward past the front turret, sufficient to guard you against a shot coming in from most reasonable angles. And of course, if there's a decent chance you might be closing in on somebody head on, which the British were, at least thought they would be quite happy to do, then there's still a possibility of a down the throat shot. So a bulkhead made sense there. And likewise aft. The problem is when you've then got the magazines abutting your machinery section, in the case of a normal layout, both fore and aft, then you have to extend the belt armor at the thickness you want to defend the magazines past your aftmost forward turret and forward of your forwardmost aft turret to protect you from those angled shots, and then eventually the protection over the machinery will take over. But that's two sets of significant extensions, and made more so by the fact you do have to somewhat displace the magazines from the boilers and the other machinery to avoid heat issues with your ammunition. Whereas if you concentrate all your armament in one place and all your machinery in another, then you only have to have that kind of belt-wing overlap once instead of twice. And again, depending on how much you value your machinery, you might also be able to get away with thinning down that aft bulkhead if there isn't a main battery gun back there. So you're essentially concentrating all your weight for weight-saving purposes. Now, in respect to this particular layout of 2 fore and 1 immediately aft, as opposed to, say, a Nelson style all 3 forward, that's where you have to make certain priority calls. For example, the G3 layout gives you slightly better aft fire than the Nelson layout does, but it also allows you to have a secondary battery up front, whereas a Nelson class, all the secondary battery has to be right aft. You can see here on the World of Warships Recreation, there's a couple of secondary turrets just underneath the bridge structure. The trade-off is it's not quite as efficient at concentrating your magazine citadel as the Nelson style arrangement, so, swings and roundabouts there. But one of the other issues is, especially with the G3s and to a lesser extent with the N3s, weight distribution overall, because the Nelson class are very compact and, compared definitely to the G3s, relatively slow, whereas the G3s have a lot of machinery, so lots more machinery space, a fair bit of weight, so therefore ideally you want as much weight as possible to balance out an extremely long hull, and at that point actually having the turret immediately behind the bridge structure puts that turret almost near enough right on the ship's centre, not just centre line but also amidships, which minimises its effect on overall weight distribution, and then your forward 2 turrets are essentially counteracting the weight of a very long machinery space going further aft. Obviously the N3s have somewhat less machinery because they don't have to go quite as fast, but again, having this turret set up on them allows you to concentrate everything very much towards amidships, which again will save you somewhat on balance because you don't have to put extra heavy weights or extend your armor further forward or further aft to help trim the ship. It is a fairly balanced design with the center of gravity for the armor pretty much at the center of gravity and center of rotation for the ship as a whole. Ian Carr asks, why did so many pre-dreadnoughts develop with 2 funnels alongside each other? 2 primary reasons, really. Firstly, as you can see here from this cross-section of the Majestic class, the boilers they were using were quite large proportional to the overall ship. So trunking a lot of them into a single funnel would have been a little bit difficult because they're not just, fairly large. As you can see, they're Scotch boilers, cylindrical looking at the side. They're also quite long. But the other problem is that an awful lot of early pre-dreadnoughts, be they British or whoever else, tended to have longitudinal bulkheads. So that's a bulkhead that runs fore to aft down the centre line of the ship, basically right above the keel. And this was part of the subdivision, with the idea being obviously to minimize flooding. But in order for such a bulkhead to be effective, it has to go fairly high up. And as again, you can see, especially if you look at the top part of this picture, for a longitudinal bulkhead to be effective against water, it's got to go reasonably above the waterline. And if you run above the waterline, even on a Majestic class pre-dreadnought, and the same for a Royal Sovereign, you're coming actually fairly close to the upper deck, at which point having to do some very last minute near horizontal trunking to get a single large funnel amidships is going to be fairly impractical, at which point it's just easier to trunk, and less complicated for that matter, to trunk two funnels next to each other side by side. And as I said, you see this on quite a lot of different pre-dreadnought designs, and obviously on some of them they even have multiple pairs of funnels side by side. Vicky asks, what would an Italian-style money-is-no-object rebuild of older American or British battleships, such as the Wyomings, New Yorks, or perhaps in a world where First London extends the building holiday but doesn't mandate additional scrappage, the Floridas or the Iron Dukes, look like? And what would be the capabilities of these rebuilds? So for the Royal and US Navies, I don't think even with money as no object they would have refitted the 12-inch ships, because the work that would be necessary to bring them up to a generally modern standard would leave you with a ship that essentially really only has the armament to be a cruiser killer but not the speed. And that might be useful for some navies, but for particularly the US and UK navies, they've got plenty of other ships. They don't need to worry about that so much. But the 13.5-inch and 14-inch ships in the respective navies might have some good uses. Now, obviously, a lot of this will draw on what the Italians did, because they did a pretty good job, let's face it, all things considered. But drawing first on the Iron Dukes, looking at what they did for Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, for instance. So, yep, both the Iron Dukes and the New Yorks or Texas are going to have bow extensions to help them move faster through the water. And you're going to replace all the machinery with modern, fully oil-fired machinery. So greater power density and so forth. And with the Iron Dukes, as they did again with Valiant and Queen Elizabeth, you're going to be removing the casemate battery. You're going to be filling in that kind of stepped in part of the bow section as well. So it's got a nice smooth deck. Yep, you're going to be losing the Q turret, the amidships turret. That might allow you to squeeze in a little bit of extra machinery, which along with the bow extension hopefully will get you up to 27, 28 knots. And then in place of that, you are going to have to find a secondary battery. Now, historically speaking, based on what they did with QE and Valiant, that's almost certainly, and Renown for that matter, that's almost certainly going to be a bunch of 4.5-inch pancake turrets. Ideally 5 twins per side, maybe 4. And with British practice at the time, probably the direct midships area where Q turret was is probably going to become a hangar and launch area for seaplanes. If it was me personally, I wouldn't do that. I personally would adopt a much smaller flight facility, considering these are upgraded battleships that are probably going to be operating with the rest of the fleet. So I'm going to obviously give them early radar and so forth. But if it was me personally, I would build a miniature stepped tier deck that in the middle for the installation of medium caliber anti-aircraft guns. So maybe some octuple pom-poms basically running along a spine so they can bear port and starboard, and then maybe some other pom-poms either side of that, stepping down but still being able to fire over the 4.5s. And since you're doing a complete strip down and rebuild, obviously you're going to be replumbing everything for oil, so you could probably cut into some of the coal bunkers, if not necessarily entirely, and partially integrate. So you'd be partial integration, partial bulging of a full torpedo defense system. Now for Texas, you will have a few things slightly different. You are still going to need the bow extension and the refitting of the engines and the removal of, in this case, turret 3, still the center turret. However, thanks to US practice, you're probably going to get away with a few other changes a little bit different to the British ship. So you're still going to be deleting the casemate batteries, But for the Texas, I would be tempted to give it a slightly more flared stern just to fit a little bit more space on, because then I can have standard US practice for aircraft, which just to have them right on the stern, on the fantail, which means I don't have to worry about aircraft amidships. Now, if I'm cutting down the casemate gallery that's directly beneath the bridge, and also plating and fairing in the bow properly, that also gives me a nice long run, in this case for, depending on Texas's exact size, I'm not sure whether you could fit full 5-inch 38 twins down at either side. Whether you'd go with single 5-inch 38s or maybe develop a basic twin 5-inch 25 mount, I don't know, but whatever the case, 5-inch somethings down either side as a secondary battery, that's perfectly fine. But I would be a little bit perhaps of a radical and suggest that in Texas's case, again, I would like to see that spinal ridge where turret 3 in this case was. But there I would suggest actually putting some of the 5-inch in twin mounts down the spine in amidships, and actually then having the lighter or medium anti-aircraft guns on either side, just because the way the US ship is laid out, I think would benefit a little bit more from that as opposed to the other way around with the British pancakes. So in both cases, you'd end up with a ship with 8 main guns in 4 twin turrets capable of 27 to 28 knots, still carrying its original armour, with a decent torpedo defence system and a reasonable anti-aircraft battery. Now, obviously, they're not necessarily going to be able to go completely toe-to-toe with treaty battleships, because those that carry guns of a roughly similar size are going to tend to have more of them, and the ones that carry similar numbers of guns are going to have bigger guns. But they would be within shouting distance, so they would make very good support ships for other fast battleships capable of that kind of speed. And of course, they'd be perfectly capable of either going toe-to-toe with, or actually in most cases actually overmatching a whole bunch of enemy ships. So against the Cavours and Duilios, for instance, so they'd have similar speed, better armour, bigger guns. Against the Scharnhorsts, similar-ish armour, although the Scharnhorst might have a slight advantage there, but similar number of guns and much heavier. Against the Congos, same number of guns, roughly similar calibre, much better protection. Also quite good at hunting down Panzerschiff, because they'd be about the same speed, but obviously far better firepower and protection. And because they're able to keep up and they are multipliers to the fleet's overall numbers, as I said, you can potentially have 1 or 2 of them assigned to, in the early part of World War II, your 1 or 2 new fast battleships, whether that's King George V or North Carolina, Washington, etc., which gives you a fast fleet battle line anchored on a absolutely brand new modern ship, but which also gives you a numerical advantage both in terms of number of guns and number of hulls going up against the Axis fast capital ships, wherever they happen to be. Information Mimic asks, will you be doing a biography for Admiral Makarov one day, perhaps? Perhaps one day, but if my experience with hunting down more information about Rozhesvensky's life that isn't the 2nd Pacific Squadron is anything to go by, it's going to be a fairly difficult one to do. So again, as with a lot of these obscure subjects that cover more foreign language or foreign admiral types, if anybody out there happens to know of any decent non-English sources for Admiral Makarov, perhaps a official biography or something like that, presumably in Russian, then please let me know, and then I can go and try and hunt it down. Because once I've been pointed in the direction of a foreign language source, I can usually by hook or by crook wring the information out of it. It's finding the thing in the first place. And with Makarov, I think it's going to be harder, partly because obviously there's a reasonable level of interest circulating around the 2nd Pacific Squadron, which means that Rozhesvensky gets a little bit more written about him, but also because, ironically enough, of the defeat of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, there wasn't really a huge amount named after Rozhesvensky afterwards, whereas various post-Admiral Makarov ships have been called Admiral Makarov. which means if I try and search for Admiral Makarov, either in book catalogues or just generally on the Russian side of the internet, such as that is, you can get overwhelmed with more common search results for the ships rather than the poor person himself. H. Shonaraki asks, besides joining the submarine fleet after a brief lecture in nuclear energy, were there any other proposals for the captured Nagato and Prinz Eugen? And if there weren't, what would have been some cool alternative uses for these two ships? Could they perhaps have been sold to another nation? Apart from some initial technological evaluation which was done before they were selected as nuclear targets, I don't believe there was any particular plans to use Nagato or Prinz Eugen in any other role. And selling them on to other nations would have been very problematic. For one thing, obviously, Nagato at that point was quite an old ship. And in both Prinz Eugen and Nagato's cases, you would have been looking at, well, where is that nation that's presumably buying them going to get the spare parts? And who would want it as well? Because in the late 1940s, pretty much any nation that wants battleships, with the exception of Russia, already has plenty of battleships, and the only other ones that I can think of would be maybe the South American countries, or maybe Turkey if they want to replace Yavuz. But the South American countries are only just, with a very loose definition of the word just, able to keep their battleships in play, and sometimes not even then, and those are older and cheaper and easier to maintain ships than something like Nagato. The US is not giving the Russians Nagato at any point in the late 40s or early 50s, and that pretty much leaves, well, the French, but they've got Richelieu and Jean Bart, so they're not going to want Nagato. And as I said, the British have got more battleships than they know what to do with, so they're not going to want it either. No one else really is in a position to have them. The Italians weren't allowed to have the Littorios back, and given that the Littorios were there, if the Italians were ever going to get a battleship back, they would want one they'd built themselves. So between age and just, well, where are you going to get the spares, Nagato was always destined for a fairly short active service life after the war ended. In theory, you could have made her a war museum, I suppose, but even then that would have probably had its own issues. Pretty much the only option for Nagato's continued survival, if she wasn't turned into a trophy museum, would have been to send her back to Japan, but the US was very keen on Japan not having any substantial military for quite a while. Prinz Eugen, theoretically, there are a few more possibilities in play, because a lot more navies can afford a heavy cruiser, and there are a number of navies that don't have heavy cruisers or don't have many of them who might want her, especially because she is much newer. The French, for instance, potentially might have had an interest in her, because obviously they'd been forced to scuttle pretty much all their heavy cruisers, bar one or two, in 1942. And the French are, of course, right next to Germany and have also taken on a bunch of other ex-Kriegsmarine ships, so maintenance, spare parts, and operation for the French probably actually not as much of a problem as they would be for virtually anybody else. And as we would go on to see, any reasonably new heavy cruiser potentially had a second life as a refitted missile or semi-missile ship in the Cold War. So there were possibilities in that regard, but even then, people were still relatively strapped for cash, and I think outside of maybe allocating or selling her to France, there's not really much else that someone's going to do with Prinz Eugen. The US has heavy cruisers coming out their ears, the British don't really want her, and who else is going to have it? Again, apart from the Russians, and no one's going to give it to them. Cold Warrior asks, with hindsight, it's easy to joke about how bad the Russian fleet was, but in its own time, how did other European navy or army leaders rate its chances against the Japanese? This is obviously for the Battle of Tsushima. It is a rather interesting one, because it actually depends very much on the exact timing of when they're making that evaluation, because for a good chunk of the 19th century, For example, if we take the British had looked at the Russian fleet as potentially a fairly serious threat. And yeah, I know, in hindsight that sounds a bit silly, but the two-power standard was, well, we need to be as big as the next two navies put together. And for the vast, vast, vast majority of the 19th century, that was the French fleet and the Russian fleet. So, partly out of a general assumption of, well, we have to assume that the enemy is at least, a 5 out of 10, i.e. average incompetence, and then multiply that up by the on-paper capabilities and numbers of their ships, that made the Russian fleet look fairly intimidating. And most people who didn't have extensive intel about the Russians would assume similarly. And of course, when the Russian fleet did show up in international waters, they tended to send out their best ships with their best crews and captains to give a bit of a show. And, to be fair, the Russian fleet at various points in the 19th century had put in a few good showings, against the Ottomans, for example. So there was this general feeling of, they might not be the best navy in the world, but they're probably at least average, at which point the size of their fleet and their on-paper capabilities makes them a reasonable threat to most people. And when you add up the numbers of their ships comparative to the Japanese, then theoretically the Russians should win, would be the assumption. Of course, once things actually got going, then the evaluation of the Russian fleet started to change quite quickly. The first Pacific Fleet, or first Pacific Squadron, was actually probably pretty much the best of Russia's fleet. And okay, yeah, they got hit in Port Arthur, they got mined, etc. And then the Battle of the Yellow Sea didn't really go their way, which was leading to some questions. I mean, there were obviously a lot of downsides for the Russians in that whole early Pacific War of the Russo-Japanese War environment, but they were underperforming a little bit compared to what people thought they should have done. But as I say, the interesting variables gave everyone, maybe there was a little bit of room for doubt there. But then the early escapades of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, just in their initial voyage through the North Sea and down the English Channel, as we saw with Admiral Beresford's evaluation, by the time they got to the southwestern tip of Europe, everyone had realised, actually, the bulk of these guys don't really seem to know what they're doing. And perhaps we've been over-evaluating them all this time, which is interesting because actually pretty much that was the worst single point to make an evaluation of the Russian fleet, because they were pretty much at their worst performance at that stage. As has been covered in other Drydock questions, they were actually a lot better once they got to Tsushima. Not that it helped them all that much, but the 2nd Pacific Squadron that fought the Battle of Tsushima was an infinitely more capable force than the one that shot up a bunch of fishing trawlers at Dogger Bank, although that's so low a bar to clear you'd pretty much have to be a limbo champion to go underneath it. BRNRDS asks, off topic, but I've been curious about this for some time. Do you, Drach, have anything against the Portuguese navy throughout history? While admittedly relatively little of consequence came out of them since the mid-1700s, outside of the period when the Portuguese navy was under Spanish control in the 1500s, there's relatively little to no mention of the Portuguese navy on the Channel. I don't have anything in particular against the Portuguese navy. I think it's just that the areas where they would most commonly feature happen to be areas I haven't quite covered yet. I mean, off the top of my head, further on in the question, he actually mentions two officers who at some point I do need to do profiles on, Charles Napier and Thomas Cochrane, who had dealings with the Portuguese navy. So, of course, when I cover them, especially Cochrane, I would also cover the Portuguese navy, but I haven't got around to doing them yet. There are various Portuguese naval operations in the Age of Sail, particularly in the Napoleonic Wars, which are also quite interesting and worth covering. There's a video I want to do for the latter part of the 19th century, which is basically small and interesting ironclads, basically looking at ironclads that usually go a little bit under the radar because they're not the big navies ironclad. So like the Vasco da Gama here, that's actually got quite an interesting little story behind it. So the Portuguese would obviously feature partially in that. There's the whole story of the Azores in World War II, which I'm hoping to tell later this year. There's Prince Henry the Navigator and early Portuguese exploration in the Carrack-Galleon age. So there is a reasonable amount to feature about the Portuguese Navy. It just, by sheer coincidence, I haven't actually gotten around to covering those particular elements or periods just yet, but they will eventually come. Ian Carr asks, is there any explanation as to why HMS Iron Duke's shooting at Jutland has been judged to be so accurate and better than others, including sister ships in her own division? So it's a combination of people and place. In terms of place, Iron Duke, when the battle line deploys, is towards the forward part of the middle of the battle line. And that's actually pretty much the ideal place to be shooting from, as it turns out, because ships at the very front of the battle line and ships at the very rear of the battle line, thanks to a mixture of gun smoke and funnel smoke from the British battlecruisers, as well as the general mist and weather conditions, etc., often had some trouble ranging on their targets. Now, while Iron Duke was subject to interference from smoke of both the funnel and gun varieties, plus the misty conditions, the mid-section of the British battle line as a whole was the least affected by it. So, obviously, therefore, she was in a position somewhat better off than many other ships in the Grand Fleet. And particularly her exact position meant that when the Grand Fleet initially opened fire, she was a little bit behind where everybody was turning from, roughly speaking, east by northeast to southeast or east by southeast. And so there was that break in where the smoke would be streaming as well, which helped her. So that's part of it. But the other part is the people. Now, obviously, she's Jellicoe's flagship. Jellicoe's quite keen on his gunnery. But also, her captain is Frederick Dreher. And some of you might immediately have had your ears pick up at that, because, of course, Dreher was the inventor of the Dreher table, which was the most widely spread fire control system in the Royal Navy. And he was widely considered to be the Royal Navy's foremost expert on naval gunnery. So he was essentially a British World War I version of Admiral Lee. So if you've got the Admiral on board, and he wants you to be a good gunnery ship, and the captain of the ship is, as I said, essentially a British version of Admiral Lee, and he's been in command of the ship for a little while at this point, and some of the gunnery officers, the senior gunnery officers, are also not half bad in and of themselves. You suddenly have essentially an elite gunnery ship that's given one of, if not necessarily the best, but certainly one of the best firing positions for a British battleship at the Battle of Jutland. And at that point, suddenly it becomes somewhat less remarkable that she manages to pull off an insanely high hit rate compared to literally everybody else on both sides.
HMS Impractical asks, Battleship Dante Alighieri, to me, looks like an excellent and innovative design for its time. It's faster than average, has a main battery and triple turrets, and even has some secondary turreted guns. To me, the follow-up Italian dreadnoughts feel like a devolution with less speed and an inefficient 13-gun broadside. What were the Italians thinking? And similarly, at the same time, the French were planning the Normandy and Lyon-class battleships with 12 and 16 340mm guns respectively, having 3 or 4 turrets each weighing 1,500 tons on a hull that displaces less than 30,000 tons sounds dangerously oversized as an armament. So what were the French thinking? Well, in both cases, to an extent, it's actually the same factor, and that is guns. Bearing in mind that for a fairly long period up to this point, you'd only really seen 11 and 12-inch long-barreled guns for battleships. Now, yes, you had much larger guns, 13, 16, 16.75, 17-inch, etc., prior to that, but those were older, shorter barrel weapons using more primitive, if you like, propellant. And so in terms of modern gunsmithing, the ability to build larger, and therefore also longer, weapons was actually somewhat restricted within the scope of the pace of the dreadnought race. And for what were essentially by now, in the case of the French and in actuality just generally in case of the Italian, the smaller navies, they just weren't able to keep up with that pace. Now, they would obviously go on to develop the ability to build larger guns, but it was taking them longer. And so going for the French one first, because that's actually the easier one, the French idea was simply, well, we need to get more ships in the water quickly in order to match the ongoing escalation in armament and size that other nations, particularly obviously the British and the Germans and to an extent the Americans, are doing. But we don't have the time or the resources or the money to develop a whole brand new armament. They did think about it, but decided against it. And they decided just in the interests of alacrity, it would actually just be better to have more of the existing guns, because remember, they also thought that battle ranges were going to be quite short compared to what everyone else was thinking. And so at the ranges they thought they were going to be fighting, the same 340mm gun they'd used on the Britannias should have been perfectly adequate. And at that point, well, if someone's slinging around 8 15-inch guns or a dozen 14-inch guns, well, then having a dozen or then later 16 of your own 340mm guns, yeah, they might be a bit smaller, but collectively they still have a lot of throw weight and, of course, more chances to hit. So that was essentially their thinking, making up for a lack of heavy guns with just having more. With the transition from the Dante Alighieri to the Conti di Cavour and then obviously later to the Andrea Dorias, partly it was this thing of, again, we can't build bigger guns than a 12-inch, so we're going to have more. Now, you can make a certain argument as to whether just having one more gun, with the later Italian dreadnoughts having 13 as opposed to the Dante's 12, was worth having a whole additional turret and having the arrangement of 3 triples and 2 twins, but that's a different argument. But some of the other choices are somewhat explicable. I mean, you look at Dante's armament, yes, she does have some secondary turreted guns, but the majority of her secondary guns are encasemaents within the main hull, whereas with the Andrea Dorias and the Conti di Cavours, while all of the guns are reverting to casemates, they are moved generally up to the level that Dante's secondary battery is in because of the more extensive superstructure amidships. So in terms of height and ability to fight in, rough seas and everything, more of the Conti di Cavour and Andrea Doria's guns could be used as compared to Dante's, although obviously the turrets are technically superior. They do also add more weight, and when you're trying to field 5 main battery turrets, there probably just isn't the space for them. But according to Italian sources, the 2 biggest concerns the Italians had with the Dante, which obviously is why they changed things around, was total arcs of fire. So Dante had 12 guns, but they were concerned that they could only bring those to bear over a limited broadside arc. Whereas the arrangement they did with the subsequent dreadnoughts, you could have at least 5 instead of 3 guns firing fore and aft, plus obviously a slightly bigger broadside. Again, you could make an argument that maybe they'd have been better off just doing 4 triples again, but super firing a bit like the Tegethoffs, but that's neither here nor there. The other issue was armour, not in terms of the thickness of armour. The Italians were actually relatively fine with the thickness of Dante's protection, but they felt that it didn't cover a large enough area. And so although the overall thickness of armour doesn't really increase that much in the Conti di Cavours and the Dorias, it does cover a larger portion of the ship. And of course, that plus the additional weaponry all adds up to more weight, which means that if you're going to keep it roughly speaking within the same size limits, although displacement's going up, then you have to drop something, and they ended up dropping speed a little bit to pay for those other things, because again, limited infrastructure couldn't really build all that much larger without running out of dockyard space and money. Sam Signorelli asks, we all know in World War II the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army were at each other's throats at a time when they really should have been working together, which seriously hindered their ability to conduct war, although that was fortunate for the Allies. On the other hand, the Germans don't seem to have had the same issues between their various service branches, aside from the SS. So if these positions had been reversed, how might that have affected the war in each theatre, and how would the Allied forces have been able to deal with this? Well, firstly, there were some fairly serious inter-service rivalries between the various German armed services. Now, granted, they weren't quite as bad as some of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy ones, where outright assassination was not off the table. But you did have things like Goering turning around and going, if it flies, it belongs to the Luftwaffe, therefore everybody else can, serve me if they want aircraft, to the extent that even the catapult-launched Arado 196s on most Kriegsmarine large vessels technically belonged to the Luftwaffe, and it was one of the major stumbling blocks for getting an air group ready for the Graf Zeppelin as well. But the majority of the inter-service rivalries in the Germans' case tended to be in terms of everybody had established their own little fiefdom and going, this is my fiefdom, nobody else come near it, like with Goering and aircraft. Whereas in some ways, I think the fact you have only the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy is some, not all, but some of what exacerbates the problem, because they then have overlapping interests in the air, for example. Now, there is the whole other thing of the army in Japan essentially seeing their destiny in mainland Asia and the Navy seeing their destiny out in the Pacific and to a lesser extent Indian Oceans. So there is a whole political element as well, whereas obviously in Germany, Der Führer is the one who's in charge and everybody else, kind of does what he says or has to be very, very good at persuading him. But the existence of a separate aerial service, the Luftwaffe, does take a lot of the potential direct conflict between the German army and the Kriegsmarine out of the equation. And of course, geographically speaking, Germany is going to be relying mostly on its army in this subsequent war. The Navy is not necessarily just a nice to have, but it is an extension of the German war effort rather than a core component thereof, as compared to the Japanese, where, well, if they're going to go to war anywhere, they absolutely need the Navy. Even if they were going to follow the Army's idea of mostly pursuing Japanese territorial expansion in mainland Asia, you still need a Navy to get troops to and from and protect them, and so on and so forth. Which in part was why the Japanese army built up its own little navy as well, because they didn't like relying on the Japanese navy, but there you go. So if you flip that situation around, it's almost certainly a big win for the Allies in Europe, because now there isn't a Luftwaffe, there'll be a, Kriegsmarineflieger maybe? Now at first that might be bad news for the Royal Navy, because that means there's probably going to be a lot more thought into anti-shipping operations by said Kriegsmarineflieger, which is going to be in sharp contrast to historically, where the Germans had to rely essentially on dive bombers because, well, their torpedo bombers either didn't exist, or once they'd adapted them from other aircraft, it turned out they didn't have particularly good aerial torpedoes either. But then you're also going to have the German Army Air Force, and obviously you're going to have more split, more division within an already relatively small German aircraft industry, so that's going to hamper things, generally speaking. But also, the German army, if it has complete control over its air assets, is going to probably focus even more on tactical bombers, so Stukas and other similar things, and even less on air superiority fighters and longer-range twin-engine bombers. So overall, although the Germans might have more anti-shipping strike capability, the overall German air effort is probably going to be somewhat weaker and certainly less able to exert a strategic influence. So something like the Blitz will probably not be quite as bad. And with a split in production lines, therefore overall fewer aircraft, it might be easier to roll the Germans back in the air somewhat sooner than previously. And that's before we get into, what happens if Raeder starts trying to stab Goering in the middle of Nazi party conferences and so forth. The interesting thing, though, is going to be what happens in the Pacific, because you see from the Norwegian campaign, the Kriegsmarine and the German army don't necessarily have too much of a problem operating together. There is friction, but nowhere near as bad as the Japanese army and navy. So if the revised Japanese army and navy are much more willing to work together, in terms of landings, support, shore bombardment even, that could make things much more difficult for the Allies, because it's much more likely that, well, the lightning advances the Japanese accomplish are probably going to be accomplished even faster and more effectively. The interesting thing as to whether or not it works out, roughly speaking, equal in terms of difficulty because of increases there but decreases elsewhere, or whether it just generally gets harder for the Allies, is really going to depend on what happens to the now Imperial Japanese Air Force, the Luftwaffe equivalent, as an independent service. What is it going to focus on? It's going to be the youngest of the three, but if they camp out their little area and go, right, aircraft are our domain, are they going to insist absolutely that they also control all the aircraft on Japanese aircraft carriers, or does the Japanese Navy get its version of the Fleet Air Arm? And given the expanses of the Pacific, are they going to turn around and go, maybe we should have, multi-purpose bombers, i.e., we're likely to need long-range bombers, but there's every opportunity that we might end up attacking ships as well as bombing land targets. So are we going to build mostly long-range 2, 3, and 4 engine bombers, which, especially with the 2 and 3 engine ones, can do torpedo strikes as well as level bombing? Or are they going to go all in on the tactical support role for the army and maybe just argue that they can base themselves out of little island bases to support the Navy if necessary? And I think if they take the latter approach, that will actually weaken the capabilities of the Japanese Air Force relative to what you had historically, which will make the overall difficulty increase for the Pacific campaign probably about even, just different. Whereas if they take the theoretical optimal approach of letting the Imperial Japanese Navy have its own air arm, but also focusing perhaps on long-range fighters, because they've got to defend the Japanese home islands and all these new possessions they're picking up over large distances, and they focus on more large bombers with perhaps an extended torpedo capability, as opposed to the host of small single-engine theoretical bombers that the Japanese had, plus obviously the split in multiple bomber types because of the Army and Navy having their own competing requirements. That might make life a lot more difficult for the Allies, because then instead of, say, with Force a specialist bomber unit coming in and eventually taking out Prince of Wales and Repulse, if almost any Japanese twin or 3 engine bomber can do that, yeah, you might now have problems. Paul Frederick asks, just reading Landing in Hell by Pete Margaritis about the landings in Peleliu. The invasion didn't go well and had very high casualty rates, and one of the areas that received criticism was the naval bombardment by Admiral Oldendorf. He had 4 battleships supposedly firing just over 500 16-inch and just under 1900 14-inch rounds. He and his staff felt the targets had been adequately hit, whereas the Marines on the island had very different opinions. How much explosive is in a 16-inch or a 14-inch high-capacity shell? And since big guns firing at short ranges have a flat trajectory, and enemy positions in defilade might not be able to be engaged, and given that at Peleliu many big shells were reported to ricochet because of their flat trajectory, could battleship guns have been used like howitzers to increase the tube angle and reduce the propellant charge and get plunging fire so as to better hit targets? So in terms of the howitzer thing, yes, it is in theory possible to reduce the charges in a battleship's gun to make it so that if you're firing over a certain range, you have to aim higher, therefore the shell comes in on more of an arc. But there are significant limitations to this. The Iowas have a setting that allows them to essentially do exactly this, replicating the muzzle velocity of a 16-inch 45 in order to drop Mark 8 shells on a battleship-type target with a steeper trajectory at long range, thus better deck penetration. So it's possible to do, but you have to come up with completely new firing tables for your reduced charge, and there is a limit to what you can do, because bearing in mind most howitzers are firing at angles well above 45 degrees, whereas on battleships, a gun that can elevate to 40 degrees is fairly impressive. Elevating past 45 degrees is not really a thing. So, in theory, yes, you could generate a kind of shore bombardment charge and high elevation for battleship guns, but the plunging that you're going to get is only going to be limited as compared to a true howitzer because of the absolute elevation limits of the guns themselves. Plus, part of the reason that the battleships were so close that they were essentially firing almost horizontal was to help with accuracy, because as I've mentioned before, battleship guns are generally designed to hit targets several hundred feet long, not bunkers which may only be a few tens of feet across. So getting closer, improve accuracy, hit better, but obviously also then flatter trajectory. If you start using a smaller charge and firing more up into the air, a bit like a howitzer, you are potentially affecting the overall accuracy. So you might get a better hit if you hit, but you might not hit or hit nearby. In terms of bursting charge, the 14-inch shells that they used had just over 100 pounds of explosive aboard. The 16-inch shells had just over 150 pounds of explosive aboard. So, yeah, the 16-inch shells would make a considerably bigger bang. They've got about 50% more explosive. But, to be perfectly honest, if you're being hit by 100 pounds of explosive or 150 pounds of explosive, if you're actually hit by that, the main question is not will you survive? The main question is just how many pieces are you going to be in? But apart from shell skipping, the other problem that you have with a lot of actually the bombardments in the Pacific campaign is that after the first view, where the Japanese lose a fair number of men in sort of relatively lightly prepared defensive positions trying to directly contest the landings, the Japanese adapt, and when the bombardments begin, most of their troops and even some of their heavier weapons are just embedded deep underground in bunkers and so forth. So even if you did blast the surface defenses, well, there just aren't people there. So if they then pop up once you finish the bombardment, that's just a general limitation of artillery bombardment as a whole. But also a lot of the islands that are being attacked are either coral atolls or volcanic islands, and it was found that if it was a volcanic island, then volcanic sand and soil tended to be very, very good at just damping the effect of a shell. The shell would go in readily enough because it's fairly loose, but because it was loose but relatively dense, when the shell went off, it was kind of like just piling sandbags over a shell, which is actually one of the ways that demolition teams these days use to minimize the effect of a blast. And with primarily coral atolls, you do have coral sand, but also an island that's mostly made up of rocks and so forth associated with coral. It's both very hard wearing, so it takes a fair bit of damage, or a fair bit of explosive to damage it. But then because of the sort of hollow and somewhat broken up nature of coral in an island form, it also doesn't transmit the shock anywhere near as well as more traditional rock and soil that you'd find on a big island or on a continental target. Now, of course, there are ways to address this, and US shore bombardment doctrine was evolving constantly over time, but as I said, Japanese defensive doctrine was evolving as well, combined with various geographical advantages. And in fact, apart from the broken up coral and volcanic sand issues, a lot of what you see in terms of US Navy shore bombardment versus Japanese preparations to defend against it very much mirrors the evolution of trenches and dugouts and bunkers versus artillery bombardments in the Western Front of World War I. Tradesman's Entrance asks, if Tengo had succeeded and Yamato successfully beached herself, how would the eventual magazine detonation have differed from a magazine detonation at sea? Would the hull only being supported at the bottom by sand versus fully supported by water have any substantial effect on the explosion? Well, on the one hand, if Tengo had succeeded and Yamato had managed to beach herself, she probably would have burned through an awful lot of her ammunition by the time she was captured or destroyed, so any theoretical magazine explosion probably would have been a lot less, simply because there would have been less explosive aboard. But if we assume that she's gone really, really hard aground, run right up, so the majority of her hull is exposed, because obviously if she just touches the bottom and stops, well, the hull is still pretty much supported by water as it would normally be. So we're assuming she kind of goes full speed in, essentially is sitting almost high and dry, and somehow somebody manages to get some form of explosive into her magazine by hook or by crook very soon thereafter, so she's still pretty much fully loaded, then at that point the explosion would have a substantially greater effect on the surrounding environment, because ships whose magazine explodes while it's fully in the water will tend to have most of that explosion vectored upwards, and then everything comes raining down around you. Whereas if the hull is not supported by water like that, especially considering the magazines are quite deep in the ship and therefore the explosion can now vent horizontally, perhaps more so than it would do vertically, because obviously if it goes vertically it's got to punch up through the armoured deck or up the barbette and through the turret, whereas if it goes horizontally now it's just got to punch through the torpedo defence system. It can go underneath the belt, so it will be a lot more, not necessarily even a spherical explosion, it might actually be more horizontal than it is vertical, at least until the smoke continues to rise, and also will obviously therefore create a lot more shrapnel, so it'll be pretty devastating for anybody in probably quite a few miles radius around where the ship is when it explodes. Will Sanders asks, I've seen different stories of HMS Manxman outrunning a US task group even after the US commander ordered Devil take the hindmost. What parts of the story are true, and where did that phrase come from? With regards to the Devil take the hindmost phrase, it seems to have come from the late medieval period, or, well, the early 17th century at least. And essentially it's kind of, every man for himself. Basically, imagine you're being chased by the devil. Well, everyone runs as best they can, and whoever's slowest is unfortunate enough to be caught. In much the same way as, in modern parlance, if you've seen the Jurassic Park movies, you don't have to be faster than a raptor. You just have to be faster than the other people who are running away from the raptors or the T-Rex or whatever. Now, in terms of Manxman outrunning the US task group, this supposedly happening in the Suez campaign, it's very difficult to figure out exactly what went on, because there are some accounts of people who were aboard Manxman during that campaign. But annoyingly, whenever you get to the early portion of it, when everything's kicking off and the US forces in the Mediterranean are moving to try and monitor / harass / block the Anglo-French forces, they all say something at some point in the camp, usually around about this point, to the effect of, well, I won't go into details about what we did there. They're usually quite effusive about what they then did once Manxman got to the area around Portside, etc. But that early bit, when they're loading up with all sorts of things, including some journalists and reporters, it's kind of like Manxman leaves port, something we're not really going to talk about. Oh, look, we've arrived. Which suggests there's something that occurred en route that maybe the Navy didn't want people to talk about in the subsequent years. And of course, if the US Navy itself had been very embarrassed by something like Manxman come powering through, which she was entirely capable of, she was much faster than anything in the US fleet at the time, they probably wouldn't make such a big deal of it, and kind of quietly shove that to one side and not really talk about it all that much. As a result, getting any kind of information to confirm or deny that this happened is very difficult, and that's further complicated by occasional versions of either Manxman or some other Abdeel class steaming past some carrier group at extremely high speed, sometimes being told as occurring in the Second World War. But the vast majority, and indeed the originator story, if you like, all seems to be centered around the Suez Crisis. So while it's not necessarily possible to confirm exactly what happened, the fact is she was there. She did travel on a route that theoretically could have led to her encountering an American carrier task group, and she was more than capable of pulling off what the story says she was pulling off. So there's no fantastical element about the story. I suppose the main way to determine if such an encounter occurred would be perhaps if the deck logs of the US carrier group that was involved in the Mediterranean at the time were available for perusal, because then you could look through, not necessarily for specifically an encounter with the Manxman, but perhaps look for deck logs recording the fleet suddenly increasing to maximum possible speed before then dropping off for no real other apparent reason, because that would tend to indicate that perhaps there was a reason that was quietly not left around because of the potential embarrassment of, well, one of the world's most powerful warship formations just being blitzed by this slightly aged mine layer. Michael Gilson asks, in fiction, particularly in movies, I see a great deal of concern about down-the-throat or up-the-kilt torpedo shots, but in reality I don't see much in the way of protection against them. Is this because the odds of making such a shot are very low, because there isn't room to put torpedo defences in those locations, or a combination of both? Well, both factors are important, but the overriding part is that a down-the-throat shot is a short-range torpedo shot at the bow of a ship that's charging down a sub, and up-the-kilt shot is the reverse. You're firing at, again, relatively short range, but at the stern of the ship. The overall thing is it's just not possible to put torpedo defences in the bow or stern of a destroyer or really any warship, because the bow has to be a relatively light, relatively thin structure if you want to move at speed, and torpedo defences need depth, and the simple fact is there just isn't the depth at a ship's bow to put a torpedo defence. And if you're talking about a shot at the ship's stern, well, you theoretically could have torpedo defences running a lot further along the ship's stern than the bow, because the stern tends to be fuller, especially in the case of a transom stern, much further back. But at the end of the day, the big risk from a up-the-kilt torpedo shot is hitting the propellers and the rudders, and you can't put defences around those because they need to be out in the water to exert the function that they are built for. And so that's always going to be a vulnerability. You could, in theory, I suppose, argue you could put a big metal cage around them, but one, it would have to be a fairly substantial one to stop a torpedo, and two, the amount of drag that would be created would, for a relatively unlikely shot in the first place, would be far in excess of any real benefit. Now, the reason why making such a shot is relatively unlikely, partly, is because you're shooting at the narrowest target profile of a ship. So, if you take your shot and you are, let's say, 50 foot off of your aim mark, if you're shooting at the broadside of a ship and you've aimed for the centre of the ship, missing your mark by 50 foot isn't really going to matter. Against a destroyer, cruiser, battleship, carrier, you're still going to hit well amidships. Whereas if you're aiming at the bow, especially of something like a destroyer, and you're off by 50 foot, you've missed, and you've missed by a fairly wide margin as well. Plus the added stress of, well, you're taking a shot at relatively short range because the thing's bearing down on you, or in the case of the latter, it's just gone past you and you're trying to take a quick revenge shot. But the main purpose of these kinds of shots is more to give the destroyer crew something to think about or something to dodge, and therefore that they have something to occupy their minds that isn't trying to drop depth charges on or ram you, rather than necessarily getting a direct hit. I mean, obviously, if you do get a direct hit, great, fantastic, then the destroyer isn't a problem anymore. But it's more about dissuading them from coming over and giving you problems. And at the end of the day, the vast majority of submarines, when faced with a rampaging destroyer or other small anti-submarine warfare equipped vessel coming at them, is to dive and get away perpendicular to the attack, because that's a whole lot safer than staying close enough to the surface with presumably a periscope depth to risk a torpedo shot. Because, well, if you hit, as we said, great, but if you miss, which is more likely, you're now at shallow depth. You might be rammed, at which point it is pretty much curtains for you, and even if you're not, you are still going to be quite near the surface, therefore much easier to depth charge, much easier potentially to track as well. So you really are taking your life into your own hands, and therefore those kind of shots tend to be made only in extreme circumstances where you don't really have much other choice. And that's it for this week, everyone. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video at some point in the near future. Bye for now.